Hi, my name is Lynn Dome, Woman in Cybersecurity Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, sponsored by our strategic partner, Microsoft, on the topic of securing and managing risks associated with the supplier ecosystem. I'm just going to give a little bit of information about the WESIS organization. So we often go by our acronym WESIS, W-I-C-Y-S, and it's pronounced like we sisters, and that's exactly what we are. We're a cyber sisterhood. We're a community of women, allies, and advocates, over 5,000 members in 70 countries, all with a strong mission and passion to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. And we do so by creating opportunities. So we have many different initiatives, but since we're a member-based organization, we have an online member forum where all our members network and connect together. We have skill development training programs, such as our security training scholarship coming up. Applications will be opening up July 8th. We have gamified cybersecurity challenges that are funded by strategic partners. We have different type of cybersecurity competitions or learning series. And that's all in our skill development training programs. We have newsletters and webinar series, scholarships, grants, and awards that are awarded to our annual conference, which will be September 8th through the 10th this year at the Gaylord Rockies in Denver, Colorado. We also have scholarship grants and awards for other conferences as well. We have a Cyber Talent Emergency Fund where students within the last 4 semesters of graduating can submit an application to receive true emergency funds, so they get it within 48 hours to help them with certain situations such as rent for their apartments, or if they have a car or a medical emergency. We have many different speaking and media opportunities. Our goal is to provide these opportunities to build up our portfolios, add to our resumes, and showcase our talent and skills. There's a Job Board Plus Plus where all our strategic partners, like Microsoft, are able to post all their jobs, and all our members can update their profiles and upload their resumes and be recruited from. We participate in market research. We have a leadership summit and a virtual and in-person career fair. We have a Veterans and Military Spouse Assistance Program, a Veterans Apprenticeship Program, a Speakers Bureau, a mentor-mentee program. Right now we have 707 mentees, 185 mentors. Our mentor-mentee program is developed to upskill and uplevel women no matter where they're at in their careers, preparing them for their next level of advancement. Applications for the next mentor-mentee program will be opening up in August. We also have a racial equity committee. We have 36 professional affiliates in Africa, Australia, Canada, France, India, Pakistan, the UK, and all throughout the United States, and 130 student chapters in Canada, Costa Rica, India, Nigeria, Puerto Rico, and throughout the United States as well. And we owe that all special thanks to our strategic partners. They're the foundation of all things WESIS, and that's AWS, Bloomberg, Carnegie Mellon, Cisco, Facebook, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, Optum, AbbVie, Google, JP Morgan Chase & Company, Nike, SentinelOne, Workday, Dell Technologies, Envestnet, Flatiron, Fortinet, Haystack, Here Technologies, The Home Depot, IBM, MITRE, Oak Ridge National Lab, Palo Alto Networks, SANS Institute, SAP, SmoothStack, SpearTip, Starbucks, Target, and University of California, San Diego. And with that, I'd like to encourage the audience that this is your opportunity to ask lots of questions. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat functionality. So please submit your questions at any time. And our lovely presenters here, Emma and Hadley, they'll be able to get to those questions at the end of their presentation. And with that, I'd also like to encourage everyone, if you haven't done so already, is subscribe to our newsletter and never miss a beat of all things WESIS. In addition to following us on all sorts of social media, we have a Facebook page, a Facebook group, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And so without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to the Microsoft team here. We have Hadley Edwards and Hema, and I'll let you both take it from here.
Thank you so much, Lynn. We are so happy to be here to discuss a topic that suddenly seems to be everywhere these days: supplier ecosystem security and risk management. And now before we dive into the deck, I just wanted to give a quick hello. My name is Hadley Edwards. I'm a market researcher within Microsoft, and I've been heading up our security compliance and identity research practice for the past 4 years now. Hema, do you want to give a quick hello yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone. I'm Hema Prafulchandra. I'm CTO for our M365 Security, Compliance, and Management Engineering organization.
Thanks, Hema. So, securing and managing risks associated with your supplier ecosystem, that is a big title. That is a lot of words. What do we mean by that exactly here? You can see on the lower right part of this slide that there are a number of different terms that folks use to describe supplier ecosystem risk management. But no matter what terminology you're using, it's increasingly top of mind for folks, both in and out of the security system and the security space. You can see here that CEOs are very consistently looking at this topic now, and over the past year and a half, as we'll see, with increasingly fresh eyes and scrutiny. We know that ever since COVID began, the perimeter has really disappeared and disappeared at a more rapid clip than folks were initially anticipating. So hackers have upped their game, becoming more and more sophisticated and crafty in terms of where they're targeting, which means that a lot of the traditional systems and processes that people had in place are no longer enough. And one thing that's really exacerbated this, besides those external pressures that I just mentioned, is that internally, a lot of organizations are incredibly siloed, not just in terms of how they do business, but how they manage risk and how they think about the suppliers within their ecosystem and how they vet them and how they manage them, evaluate them, et cetera. This is a space where there is a lot of diversity in terms of how things are categorized and looked at. And sometimes because of that, and these more natural silos that occur within a business, it creates additional complexity, even within an organization itself, for how folks are trying to manage and create some clarity and consistency within their organizations. Now let's take a step back a little bit. Now that we've talked a lot about the doom and gloom and how important this is and what kind of attention it's getting, to understand a little bit about why it is so darn hard to manage a supplier ecosystem today. You can see here with that 1,013, that's the average number of vendors in a company's supply chain. And you can well imagine that as organizations get larger, that number gets larger as well, to the extent that a recent conversation that him and I had with a C-level customer said that we have tens of thousands of suppliers. I can't have a team going through everything for all of them. Most security teams are a little bit smaller and more nimble, and that number is just very intimidating, especially if you think about tens of thousands rather than even just thousands. And why is that number so high? Well, you can see with that 64% there, 2/3 of businesses claim to outsource more than a quarter of their daily business tasks to suppliers. That means these are folks who require access to data, sometimes very sensitive data, in order to do the job. This is how organizations are able to scale. So these folks are necessary for growth and necessary for how organizations do business and go to market today. And both organizations and the C-suite, as well as attackers, have taken notice of this, including note of the supply chain's vulnerabilities. These are some sobering numbers here, with 82% of organizations saying they've suffered a data breach in the last 12 months due to cybersecurity weakness in the supply chain. That is a staggering number. And a full 40% say that 40% of indirect attacks against weak links in the supply chain now account for that 40% of security breaches. And that number is probably only slated to go up over time. So nearly half of breaches are a result of supply chain weak links. It's incredible.
And so when you think about sort of, traditionally, we still refer to this as a supply chain. In reality, it has morphed into an ecosystem. In the past, consider, physical devices. Most of the components typically had a single source supplier, right? And we've all heard about delays in launch or lack of availability due to insufficient supply. And, I've stood in lines for tech, especially Apple tech, and had to wait a long time, right, to get that, partially due to the supply chain concerns. Even today, when we think about new innovations, when they're brought to market, oftentimes dependencies and redundancies are not considered. They wait until the product has become popular. So, you start off with a chain, but then as demand grows for your solution, you evaluate the risks, and then, the ecosystem starts forming. But sometimes you don't even realize that your primary supplier is depending on suppliers of their own. And that could trigger, as in this graphic, right, when you look at that circle marked critical path, that there may be a number of your suppliers, depending on a single supplier, that they have for the things that you want from an organization perspective. So, and then sometimes there's also concerns or lack of suppliers that you can use because of intellectual property protections and patented innovations, where you have no choice but to rely on a single source. Now, this is true for both digital and physical technologies. Risk assessments help to identify critical suppliers and their dependencies, as shown here. But the depth and the risks associated with each supplier helps identify concerns that you may want to address by, either building out redundancies or assuming the risk, right? You always have a choice of what you want to do, but you want to enable, the organization to make an informed decision, right? Not just, go blindly into it, but make an informed decision. And these assessments must be done regularly, right? Because there's a constant change in that ecosystem. And of course, whenever there are events that trigger a reassessment, such as political unrest in a region or a natural disaster that might have, impacted a number of your suppliers. So the supplier ecosystem for software is similar. A little more complicated, given the amount of open source that we have and how it is used by many vendors. And of course, some of the more sophisticated nation-state attacks leveraging open source. So with software, you are trusting all the bits that is running in your digital estate, and it's critical that you understand your supplier ecosystem.
Now, sometimes understanding that supplier ecosystem is easier said than done. And we've seen a lot of examples in the media lately of folks who have misstepped. Sometimes those might have been wholly avoidable. For example, Colonial Pipeline is one that a number of CXOs have mentioned as, we all kind of knew that they were an accident waiting to happen. And then on the other hand, you have SolarWinds, where folks are just totally taken by surprise on that and left wondering what more could have been done. I just don't know. But as mentioned previously, this topic has really extended in large part because of the seemingly consistent and constant drumbeat in the media outside of the realm of security. This is now a problem that everyone is confronted with, seemingly on a weekly or at least monthly basis, and wondering who's next, what's next. How can I safeguard my business and better understand my supplier ecosystem with the knowledge that it is incredibly complex?
And as Hadley has said, given these highly visible incidents, many nations are looking at how we can all do better. The White House released an executive order on May 12th on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which covers many dimensions, from improved public-private sector partnerships to remove barriers on sharing, threat intelligence, to modernizing federal governments by using more cloud-based solutions, to adopting the zero trust architecture, and so on. The longest section in the executive order is on enhancing software supply chain security. This section covers how to develop secure software through the use of secure software development lifecycle, generating additional artifacts like software bill of materials to provide more transparency, so you actually understand when you buy a technology what software, and because it's composed of many components, the other vendors that they may be relying on, or the open source components that is included as part of that software that you're buying. So a software bill of materials will help provide that. Think of it as a manifest, right? Just like, the typical bill of materials, as well as conducting software security testing to provide assurances that the software functions as intended and can resist attacks. So there is an aggressive schedule and a tremendous amount of work ahead for both the vendors as well as the government agencies. And I would highly recommend you get involved, read the executive order to understand what, at least, from one nation perspective, what is really important. And then participate in the NIST, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology's efforts to create standards, guidance, and best practices. And then continuing, right, from what we've shared so far and heard ourselves, leads us to the conclusion that our traditional approaches also need to evolve. And when you think about sort of the worldwide, we are on a steady pace of digital transformation. Then the pandemic hit, and we saw a dramatic acceleration in adoption of cyber technologies globally. And of course, the pandemic has had an impact on our human resources, which naturally impacts the physical. And I can talk about the impact of our global supplier ecosystem from many dimensions. But let me get back to the focus of this webinar. There are real concerns when thinking about how software is composed. As I had mentioned earlier, whenever you look at any single application or product that you have purchased to, for your organization or are using as a consumer, that one piece of product usually is composed of lots of other components, and some are open source and some are potentially other third-party vendors that have been utilized in order to build this product. And that's, when you have a packaged software, but also think about the software that is running potentially in an infrastructure that isn't hosted in your environment. So think of SaaS applications, software as a service applications. There are many examples. You can think of, if you're, in HR, you may be using an external HR system, from a third party to help manage the services that are provided as part of the HR functions, right? From recruiting to managing benefits to payroll to, communicating with your employee base and providing some training around culture and code of conduct. And so there's just, when you think about any organization, each function has so many responsibilities, and how they get that job done often relies on tools that are provided either homegrown or through third parties. But that software complexity is huge. And so when you think about it from that perspective, you have to realize that there are real concerns considering how software is composed, how it is deployed and used, from compatibility to other software and hardware, to configuration management, to educating and training the users, to availability and performance, to maintenance, to monitoring for vulnerabilities in all the solutions being used, and so on, right? Lots of challenges and lots of things to think about and address. So every organization has their hands full, and Hadley touched on this as well. When you consider firmware, operating systems, browsers, mobile apps, homegrown apps, software as a service apps, use of cloud infrastructure, and of course, the increasing attack surface and associated risks. So I love this quote from Ala. You all can read it, but we must really include our suppliers when we think about the attack surface and the risks associated with that attack surface. And, in our discussions with organizations, what we found is that they can barely keep up with their own environment and to spend any amount of resources and time on their suppliers with this, with the same amount of focus. They have to tier their suppliers because they have so many, even in organizations with even just 30, right? Suppliers versus, tens of thousands of suppliers. Oftentimes, the resources are insufficient to really make an impact and do as much against the supplier ecosystem as you do within the organization. So with that transparency and real-time sharing, it becomes almost impossible to detect cyber threats and risks across that entire supplier ecosystem. And the ability to conduct a collective incident response that spans the globe when you think about multiple legal jurisdictions, time zones, languages, and even know-how is super, super hard. So compounding this, most organizations have many functions such as procurement, legal, finance, and sometimes security and compliance, as well as a line of business involved in the evaluation of a new supplier. So negotiations on contract terms and cost and, how the supplier performs gets spread across those organizational functions. In our recent discussions, we also found that there's a lot of concerns about the reputation of the supplier in terms of their social responsibilities and how they're doing their business and behaving, meaning their code of conduct within society, is also a concern because, when you think about risk, if you had a bad supplier and, there's a negative connotations associated with that supplier, and it was discovered that you are using them as a supplier, there is a backlash and it could impact your reputation as well. So there's a lot of sort of dimensions around your supplier that needs to be considered. But when we think about it from, again, just from security and risk perspective, as associated with software, it becomes tricky. And oftentimes, sort of when you think about the complexity of managing these suppliers across so many functions, there's often delays and inconsistencies, as Hadley had mentioned earlier. And the most common methodology to assess a vendor today is via a questionnaire. So in my last company, I had to complete these questionnaires from our customers. really painful, I'll just say, regardless of whether it was an online form that we had to fill out or it was sent as an Excel spreadsheet. You know, there are lots and lots of questions, many with multiple choice responses. Some allowed free form text, but essentially, as a, you know, the organization procuring the technology, you are relying on accurate transparency from the vendor who is trying to land the sale. So you have to recognize there's some amount of, like, you know, sales taking place in these questionnaires. So these assessments are oftentimes only done at procurement or at the renewal of software. And you know, the focus, while there's a ton of questions around security and risk practices that the vendor is implementing, this process is largely done as part of procurement and may not be shared, right? Sometimes the security and internal risk teams are not involved to evaluate the responses. It really depends on what you're buying. If it's a security product, very likely they're involved. If it's a line of business specific application, they may not be thinking about, oh, we need to get our security and risk teams involved. So unfortunately, even in organizations with highly formal vendor risk and governance processes, we found that sometimes tech just showed up. For example, a SaaS application or a free application or even IoT devices were introduced into the environment and often left the security and risk functions scrambling. Over to you, Hadley.
Thank you. Now, oh, looks like we went one too far. Now, as Hema mentioned, she alluded to a number of these challenges upstream, and just a quick glance at this slide highlights the sheer volume and diversity of challenges that decision makers have to contend with within their supplier ecosystem. My eyes even blur just looking at it with just how darn many of them there are. But one common theme that you can see across all of them is that old adage of if you cannot manage what you can't measure. And that's absolutely true here. And a lot of the management complexity that comes into play is because it's so hard to measure what's going on and are we okay with that level of risk. So as we look at these four big buckets, visibility, or rather the lack thereof, automation or our over-reliance today on manual processes, integration, we talked a little bit about already how those different parts of an organization are often siloed, and Hema just went into more detail on that on the last slide. But you can imagine that not only from an organizational sort of org structure standpoint, this also has to do with our technology and where things may overlap or where there may be gaps. And of course, assessment and the fact that there isn't a whole lot of clear, consistent criteria today within an org, within an industry, or even just in general. There are no hard and fast rules or best practices. In many ways, this is like the Wild West. And you can see this wonderful quote at the bottom saying, well, we have annual check-ins with key vendors. But depending on sort of the tiering of vendors, are they a tier 1 vendor or a tier 3? We may come back every 2 years or every 3 years and redo an assessment. And as Hema just mentioned on the previous slide, sometimes that assessment is literally a questionnaire. So folks are just checking the boxes. So you can see why this C-level decision maker said, an assessment only provides you with point-in-time information, and it doesn't validate the year-round controls environment. It's a lot easier to show up well in 2D than it is in 3D. And another CXO told us during the same conversation, anything new is brought in, goes through a formal process. So they have a process, and that's great. But there's a lot of room to grow in terms of understanding the security of those vendors. Trust is a hard thing to come by. What's on paper is all I have versus what's real. I think that gets to the heart of the dilemma here. It's really hard to to measure, thus it's hard to manage, and it's hard to understand what is really going on in real time because of these challenges, because of the complexity of the system in place today.
So now let's double click on what we can do better for the digital supplier ecosystem. And so the first thing, and I've mentioned zero trust earlier, to consider is the zero trust architecture and zero trust approach. So in this world of more and more cloud-based applications and a workforce that would ideally like to work from anywhere, the zero trust architecture is strongly recommended. There is a lot to unpack on this slide, so let me start with the three core principles. So the first is verify explicitly. If you've been in our field long enough, you will recall trust but verify. And that is, if you were within the perimeter, perhaps, you could be trusted because you successfully crossed all the barriers to get in. Now with the perimeter not being there, we have to change that to say, do not assume any trust in any access and always verify. So all access is always verified. The second principle is around privileges and privilege management. So the principle is use list privileged access, meaning grant only the minimal number of privileges required to accomplish the task. Again, in the past, we in order, to allow for greater productivity, as well as, not have any users barred from doing their jobs, we granted far more access privileges than were necessary. So far too many users in an environment that had access, right, just had too many privileges of what that user could do, regardless of whether they needed them. And that, from an attack surface perspective, that was a major vector in terms of a compromised user credential with all these additional access privileges would allow them to do, essentially lateral movements or elevate into roles where they could do more harm. So in the past, productivity always trumped all other concerns. And I think by using this principle, we will hopefully be able to still maintain the productivity levels, but reduce the risk. So the third principle is assume breach. So, again, when we had the hard outer shell and, the soft, crunchy, soft inside, meaning, all our controls were at the perimeter. When we actually had a perimeter, you could assume that you were not breached because you could put all your detections along the edge and so you felt safe. But of course, this doesn't work. And now in today's world, with so many mobile devices, as well as, the cloud apps and remote users, we don't have that hard perimeter. And so you have to assume breach. You have to assume that every access, every connection between two systems could be a lateral movement. So you have to operate as if the threat actor is already in your environment and watch for anomalies in usage patterns, connections, availability, and look for lateral movements of the attacker. And so in order to access resources on the right in this diagram, think data, applications, infrastructure, your networks, right? So your environment, whether that environment is on-prem, in the cloud, or across multiple clouds, right? That is your infrastructure, and that is the assets you want protected. So when a user accesses any of your resources, they must be strongly authenticated. ideally with multi-factor authentications, right? So that the concern of compromised credentials are lower, right? Because you need multiple factors in order to compromise that user, and have numerous risk factors, such as looking for lit credentials or atypical travel, or looking at malicious IP addresses, right, where the user is connecting from, as well as looking for like IP addresses that may be linked to malware. And you know, these risk factors can many dimensions. It really depends on the industry you're in and the types of attacks you're seeing. But you have that richness of looking at not only the user and how they're authenticated, but all these other risk factors. Then the second area is to look at devices. So, you know, on the bottom left of this graphic. So that user is connecting from a device in order to access. So when you think of that device, you have to look at whether it's managed by your organization, meaning it's issued and completely in the control of your organization, or it's co-managed, meaning that the employee is using their own device, and there's partial management from your employer and controls that they've implemented on the device to a totally unmanaged device. Think, you know, you're using a device at the hotel, or, you know, somebody else's device. You know, it could be another device at home that you could be using to access the corporate assets. So the health of that device is checked, and is it running, you know, with the latest patches of all software? Is it running an endpoint security solution? Has there been any malicious activity on that device? And again, many device risk factors are considered and evaluated. And then in our example here, in the middle is this, you know, policy enforcement. And so with Microsoft Azure Active Directory conditional access, we evaluate this access information against the policy that's configured. So this combination of static policies and dynamic real-time information, such as threat intelligence, session context, and, you know, and the other risk factors that I mentioned, provides an adaptive approach to managing risks that is both consistent and informed by continuously changing real-world conditions. Meaning, you know, in the past, you might have had, you know, configured all these policies, given, you know, privileges to an individual, but now, because of all this additional visibility and analytics, threat intelligence, and automation, we can actually, in dynamic sort of real time, be able to reevaluate whether that user truly is connecting, is not compromised, it is who they are, and the device they're connecting from is in a state that we can be trusted. So we would allow them to have access. In the cases where, you know, that validation, so after that explicit validation of the user session and the device risk, if we find it's low enough, full access is granted. However, if we determine that maybe there's something not right, like for example, they're connecting from an unmanaged device, we may dynamically change their privileges so that they cannot download resources to that unmanaged devices. Whereas in the other situations where it's potentially co-managed or fully managed, we may say, yes, you can, in the fully managed, you can download, do whatever you want, you know, corporate resources. So think documents that might be sensitive, might have privacy data, you know, so PII, personally identifiable information in those. Or in the co-managed, it may restrict to, for example, applications that are part of the corporate approved applications, such as in my case, on my iPhone, I use OneDrive, And so I may be downloading the file from, in the cloud to render on my iPhone, but it's really still in the cloud and it's just rendering locally, as an example. So this very complicated, sort of, from an architectural perspective, but very easy to comprehend once you get it. And what's good about the zero trust approach is it is a journey. You're not required to see value and to see benefit. You're not required to implement all of it. You can start by, for example, simply implementing multi-factor authentication for all your users. And that leads to, value straight away. There is also a NIST publication, so special publication 800-207 that you should look at if you want to understand more. And of course, there's a lot of literature on zero trust itself. And so let me, in the interest of time, move on to sort of what we heard. So when we look at supplier ecosystem, and, Hadley and I have already talked through, an organization has so much complexity already in terms of managing security and risk just for their own organization. So when we consider the supplier ecosystem, and in speaking with many customers and realizing that they have limited resources and time, we ask them, how would they prioritize the domains that they would want to go further with their supplier ecosystem. And of the list here, the prioritization that we heard back was start with people, then with devices, applications, and infrastructure. So, interestingly, it kind of mirrors that zero trust approach. And when you think about sort of, if you had to evaluate and assess all your suppliers, tiering, meaning, identify your most critical suppliers that could have material impact on your business on a daily, daily sort of interactions could have an impact versus, those that are maybe further down in that criticality list. And then so you have to tier because you won't be able to, do the same level of assessment and evaluation across the whole supplier ecosystem, but at least look at that criticality and then target sort of the people aspects first. At least that's what we're hearing, in terms of what could really help. And then leverage tools and technologies that will help you automate some of these, right? So, to go from an annual or, as Hadley mentioned, sort of every 3-year questionnaire, how would you be able to replace even portions of that questionnaire with automated tooling and automated assessments? So look for those technologies to help you. And so, again, there's a lot of details here in terms of what do we mean by applications and what kinds of applications and what kinds of process improvements you could adopt to sort of infrastructure capabilities. And, when you think about especially if you have physical, a lot of physical presence. So, we spoke to a sort of a brand retailer with many stores globally, right? And they had some really, not only do they use a lot of technology, but they had concerns about fraud and employees in their stores colluding potentially together. And so being able to do the surveillance and being able to do it in a manner that is legal preserves, the rights of the individuals, but still protects the organization. So there's a lot of challenges when you think about your own employees, but when you start thinking about sort of the supplier people, it gets really complicated. So, when you think about this, and sort of the applications, infrastructure, people, and devices. Wrapped around it is the processes and governance mechanisms that you use. And so even the processes could themselves pose a risk, so they should be continuously reviewed and evolved, right? Your processes may be lacking. So if you had to start somewhere, and we highly recommend starting with people and devices, as I mentioned earlier, taking a zero trust approach, the first thing potentially is ask your suppliers to start implementing multi-factor authentication for anyone who has access to your environment, right? So you won't be able to get there sort of, overnight, but go on that journey with your suppliers. So with that, I will hand it back to Hadley, and I know gone super long, so apologies, Hadley.
Oh goodness, no, that's it's fascinating, and it's easy to go on because it is so complex, and there's so many different things to keep in mind as folks are trying to put together a framework. And that's really what this slide is all about. So we've thought about zero trust, and we're adopting those principles if we're one of these organizations, assessing their framework and thinking about making a change. We've assessed our domains. We're looking to prioritize people, but where does that leave us in terms of a risk management framework? Now, as mentioned earlier, because of the breadth of a supplier ecosystem and the relative nascency of this being just an acute problem to solve, and some of those more traditional methods not cutting the mustard, there are no best practices. This is not like threat protection or the SOC. There is no clear standardization. There is no roadmap or must-have widget or technology that can act as a silver bullet. But while there is that no one true framework, as organizations build their own or adopt and adapt an existing model, we found that it's important to consider tactical, practical concerns like infrastructure first, then layer in business processes and governance, and then finally, to make sure that your framework accounts for innovations. And this is something that many traditional frameworks neglect to do. And when we say innovation, some of these don't even sound like they're that net new, because we've all been hearing about them for a while, especially from a security standpoint. But traditional frameworks don't necessarily have these baked in, and it's harder to flex, whether that's for day-to-day operations or when one of those wild events happen where exceptional risk has occurred. So these are things like AI, Internet of Things, or blockchain, let alone intelligent workflows. And if we don't think about those when we're building a framework to be able to sort of flex and grow and stretch as the space changes, as attackers grow increasingly sophisticated, and even just the way that we do business continues to evolve, then our framework won't stand the test of time. And that brings us here to where we really wanted to showcase the voice of the customer here. And as Hema and I were talking to leaders over the past couple of weeks here about this subject, we've heard mixed feelings about supplier ecosystem and risk management. After a year of work from home, organizations are moving to hybrid workplaces. And this is all amidst a series of high-profile supplier ecosystem attacks. We know that a lot of these folks are investing in new strategies, and that means there's both a lot of hope, but also a lot of trepidation. You can see from a number of these comments that folks certainly have not been idle. They are jumping in feet first into educating their user base, into merging their physical and digital supply ethos, making sure that they've got a comprehensive plan. They're looking at standardization, but they also know that things like remote work has really thrown a wrench into things, and that they haven't had the luxury of time. And they wonder how many of the decisions they had to make quickly over the past year and a half are going to have to be undone, or have created new challenges that they haven't yet become totally aware of. So there's a lot to consider as the space continues to evolve and at a rapid clip, and with a heck of a lot of scrutiny from up on high. So I know we've only got about 10 minutes left. So we wanted to just quickly point out some ways that you guys can continue to dig into this space, whether you're looking to make a change in your career, or for any students looking to focus in on a career path. This is a really exciting place to try your hand. We've pulled in some data from LinkedIn telemetry to showcase folks who are active in this space today. What kind of skill sets have they been honing, both in terms of the most likely ones they may be touting on their profiles, but also the ones that are growing most quickly as the space continues to grow and change. And then finally, there are a number of places where you can dig in and engage and learn more. Hema mentioned NIST earlier, and that's a great place to start. But it doesn't stop there, including on WeSys and on Microsoft as well. So we hope that you'll continue your learning journey when it comes to this fascinating topic. And I also noticed that there are a couple of questions from the audience here. So maybe we'll just take the last 10 minutes or so here and focus in on some of those questions. And folks, please don't be shy. Make sure if there's a question you have after our conversation today, please add it to the mix.
Perfect. So maybe, Hadley, you could take the first question and I'll read it out for the audience. So the folks that got stung by the SolarWinds breach were very confident in the updates that they received from SolarWinds. Is it a reality to expect that there are any measures that these companies can take to guard against being dinged again by an infection to the SolarWinds repository? And now, when they talk about the repository, it's this, so maybe you could start by sort of unpacking the SolarWinds a little further, and then you could respond.
Sure. Well, gosh, SolarWinds, I feel like we continue to learn more all the time. And it's something that even just earlier this week, I think it was, we discovered that the folks at Nobelium have continued to keep their tentacles in there ever since the breach was first discovered back in December. Now, SolarWinds is something that a lot of folks just didn't see coming. They had a lot of trust in SolarWinds. Actually, customer conversations that we'd had in the fall had a number of folks highlighting them as one of their most trusted vendors. It's someone that even afterwards folks spoke about with disbelief. There was one CISO that mentioned, well, if it happened to them, it could happen to anyone. We were just lucky. But when we look at Microsoft's customer data, we did notice that those who had adopted a zero trust approach and had taken a lot of those recommendations were not as impacted as they could have been, even if they were SolarWinds customers. So while there's always going to be something, and I think that's maybe one just reality of living in the wonderful world of security, is that you can never be totally safe. There's always something else that we haven't thought of, or another crafty way in. If you do take these proactive steps, if you have a framework in place and a zero trust philosophy, you can mitigate and isolate that damage, and you can prevent it from just taking over and wrecking, like a domino effect, more of that supply chain or more of your internal data.
Yeah, and I'll add to that when you think about sort of open source and the amount of open source that is being leveraged, I think this truly was a wake-up call in terms of how much rigor is put against that open source. Oftentimes, companies will not pull, tech companies will not pull directly from the open source repositories, that they'll have their own instance within their organizations and they'll run a battery of tests against them. In this, sort of scenario, this was a very well orchestrated nation state attack. When you think about the amount of time they took to identify someone like SolarWinds, which, it's not considered a security tool, right? It's a performance and health monitoring largely. And so it was never, necessarily gone through the rigor that other security tech would have. And so I think number of wake-up calls, right? One is, have you really evaluated all your vendors and have the correct level of categorization, depending on the usage and the impact it could have if that was compromised. I think, definitely. In terms of what can we do better around open source, I think, as I mentioned, more evaluation of that open source, taking ownership of the open source, looking at the committers and what commitments committed code recently would help. But, there's always a fine balance between how much time and resources can you apply to this. So you have to essentially treat it as your own code and do that static analysis. You have to do all the other usual security testing that you do, but monitoring your environment, as Ali said, for the lateral movement, because that's probably the best way to mitigate or limit, right, the damage that such an attack could cause.
Assume brief.
Yeah, 3 minutes. So let's take one more question.
Sure. Let me read this one for you then. Should we just expect that there is going to be a certain amount or level of risk that we are just going to have to accept in the supply chain?
So yes, right? It's an easy answer, yes. But you have to think about the supplier ecosystem in terms of, as we talked about, many organizations are tiering their suppliers. You have to understand how these suppliers are being utilized and whether they have, as I said, material impact to your business and for what length of time, right? So for example, if you've outsourced your payroll system and that vendor has issues with availability or has a breach, the impact is maybe that one pay run does not take place. And what can you do, right? So in all these scenarios, you have to think about how you're using that supplier and what are your alternatives. In that scenario, you may not have a second payroll provider already signed up that you could, switch over to. Most companies don't do that. That's a lot of high risk because you're putting sensitive data about your employees with another, right? Like you're expanding your attack surface. So oftentimes you don't, but you do evaluate those and you think about what can you do for your employees in that scenario. And you would assume the risk, right? So you would take on the risk that, okay, yep, you've only got that single supplier. And if there is a compromise at the supplier, the impact that it will happen on you. I think there's lots of scenarios that we can talk through, and maybe Hadley, you want to share in the last minute your thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I think just knowing that there's probably no way that any company can keep up with all of their suppliers and their suppliers, et cetera, the need to prioritize and to chunk up different suppliers into different categories that get different treatment. Well, that doesn't always sound ideal. It's just sort of a practical necessity of staying on top of things and protecting your crown jewels. So we've been having a lot of conversations with folks about how do you define a key supplier? What does it mean to sort of reach that criteria? And so a number of things have sort of bubbled up consistently regardless of industry. So do they handle sensitive data and large amounts of it? Can this supplier support the business now and in the future without disruption? And sort of what does that look like? And are they critical to day-to-day operations? So things like point of sale or reporting. So even if a supplier just is a big spend on your within your system, or the activity isn't necessarily dealing with sensitive data, even if the volume is there, they may not be that tier one or key supplier. And if they are, you need to keep them on a shorter leash. There needs to be a lot less flexibility and a lot more oversight just because of the nature of that critical role. So thinking about those that you have a large scale reliance on, or those which support your company most in achieving your vision. We can't afford to have a disruption to well-being there, and just making sure that they are held to that higher standard. While real time may seem impossible right now, how can you make sure it's not just once a year with a checklist, and that you have a better view of what's going on with their own suppliers, what criteria they use? And a number of folks have also shared a little bit about coming up with industry standards, or maybe wanting to share across with other companies within their space, because if they've evaluated a supplier, what can they learn from that process so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel? So this needs to go on across the different silos within their organization, but what can they do at an industry level or across companies to help make sure that while there's always going to be risk here, they can be a little bit smarter about where they're focusing their attention, and how can they leverage the work of others to make sure that they aren't doing unnecessary duplication with the limited bandwidth that their team may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hadley. And I think that brings us to overtime. So thank you all for listening to us, and we hope this was a valuable webinar for you. All right.
Thank you, Weesis.
Bye.